Johns Hopkins Hospital in Baltimore is world famous for its world-class medical practice. It was founded by 4 physicians, and these 4 physicians are here in a picture that was painted by John Singer Sargent called The 4 Doctors. Now, there's a very interesting story about the painting of this picture. You'll notice that there's a globe in the background, a very large globe. The painter, as he was having the men pose for the picture, said there's something missing. So he essentially had the picture very much like this, but there was no globe there. And then he figured out what needed to be in the picture. There needed to be a globe in order to show that this was going to be a world-class hospital. But as you look at the size of that globe, it wouldn't fit through the door. So that was no problem to Mr. Sargent. He said, cut a hole in the wall. And they did so. But you notice the man who's standing up. He is Dr. Halstead. Dr. Halstead thought that this was a rather pretentious artist, and he didn't get along with him very well. So I'd like for us to look at the next slide. Do you notice that as you look at Dr. Halstead, who's taller, he's higher up in the picture, the second from the left, his picture is somewhat faded. Well, here's what happened. Because the painter was not getting along with Dr. Halstead, he made sure to paint his face with paints that would quickly fade. And as a result of that, here it is with even after the restoration in the year 2001 that was done, and his features are somewhat disappearing. If it had been left alone, after a while there would just be this faceless person standing up. I find this to be very much like what is happening in the book of Ruth. Because there is a man who was concerned about his inheritance and concerned about his name. And God has a sense of humor. He doesn't get named in the book. He's listed as Poloni Elmoni, a certain so-and-so. The man who wanted to be famous. The man who wanted his name to stand. We have no idea what his name was. And the man who took his place, who took his role as the near kinsman, Boaz, is a name that is famous and is in the lineage of Jesus Christ. Let's do a quick review of the book of Ruth. We saw that the book of Ruth happens during the time of the judges. It's written much later, but the events were during the time of the judges, when every man did what was right in his own eyes. Because Israel was so rebellious, God allowed Midianite marauders to come and to steal the crops as they were ready to be harvested. And people were living in dens and caves in order to escape all of the problems. Naomi, although when we saw her at the beginning of the book, no one looks at her as a great hero of the faith. But we saw that she clearly had had ministry to her 2 daughters-in-law to such an extent that they were willing to leave their own country and to come to a place where they would be foreigners and probably destitute for the rest of their lives because they had come to believe in Naomi's God. Ruth chose God and Naomi over financial security that she would have had if she had stayed home. Now we saw that Boaz was a man who had a relatively small field compared to that of Poloni Elmoni, but he had large corners that were devoted to ministry to the poor, something that God had commanded back in the books of Moses. Naomi reached a point when she saw the grace that was extended by Boaz to Ruth. She all of a sudden figured out the one thing that she had not understood about the law. And that was that the levirate marriage did not have to occur through her because she had not died childless. She had 2 sons. Both of the sons died childless, and it was possible for Ruth to be the one to carry on the lineage. Once Naomi figured that out, then we see her starting to bloom and to come to a full realization of what God had in mind. And so then she arranged a meeting that happened at the threshing floor, in which Boaz promised to Ruth that she would be redeemed. He didn't guarantee that he would be the redeemer, but he said, if Poloni Almoni does not do what he's supposed to, that Boaz would. And so when Ruth came to Naomi, Naomi told her basically, wait on the Lord, that Boaz will take care of what he has promised. Okay, let's look again at the cover shot, and you remember how Dr. Halstead is painted in paints that would quickly fade. That's what happens to Poloni Almoni, but Boaz is going to be in bright, and he's going to be bright, famous, and easy to see. We remember him because of how he stood for the Lord. Let's now look at Ruth chapter 4. We find that there is a meeting that happens, and it's an official meeting in which Boaz and Poloni Almoni appear before the elders of the city. This is so that there can be a witnessing of a real estate transaction that is going to occur. And so meetings often took place at city gates. Verse 1, now Boaz went up to the gate and sat down there, and behold, the close relative of whom Boaz had spoken came by. So Boaz said, come aside, so-and-so, sit down here. So he came aside and sat down. And he took 10 men of the elders of the city and said, sit down here. So they sat down. So Boaz shows up, he waits for Poloni Almoni to come, and then he says, I've got a little business to transact here. And then he called elders of the city so that it could be an official transaction that would occur. Well, then in verse 3, he announces that it's time to put up a for sale sign. Naomi wants to sell her land. And so in verse 3, it says, then he said to the close relative, Naomi, who has come back from the country of Moab, sold. And the reference to sold is back 10 years ago, at the point that Elimelech left, the land was sold. So this land was sold, which belonged to our brother Elimelech, and the idea is now she wants redemption. Now, land sales in Israel were not like land sales for us. It was more like a lease. And in your notes, you'll notice that I have given to you a citation out of Leviticus chapter 25, and that's going to be quite pertinent. Let's show the next slide. Notice in the text of Leviticus 25, it says, the land shall not be sold permanently. You know, we think of if you pay off the mortgage, you get the deed and it's yours. That's not how it worked in Israel. And that's going to be rather important here. For the land is mine. God is the owner of the land. For you are strangers and sojourners with me. And in all the land of your possession, you shall grant redemption of the land. In other words, if someone sells it, they can buy it back. And if one of your brethren becomes poor, like Naomi and Ruth, and has sold some of his possession, And if his redeeming relative comes to redeem it, then he may redeem what his brother sold. Or if the man has no one to redeem it, but he himself becomes able to redeem it, then let him count the years since its sale and restore the remainder to the man to whom he sold it, that he may return to his possession. But if he is not able to have it restored to himself, then what was sold shall remain in the hand of him who bought it until the year of Jubilee. And in Jubilee it shall be released, and he shall return to his possession. So we have to understand a little bit about how land was bought and sold. We don't think in terms of a year of Jubilee. What I'm doing in this slide is I am pretending that 50 years from now, the year 2062, if the Lord were to tarry that long, would be our year of Jubilee. And so if I were to sell a piece of property right now, I would be selling it for 50 years. You see what I mean? It's more like a lease. And so the price would be determined by how much that land could be expected to generate in terms of the value of its harvest for 50 years. So if you're buying, you're not thinking, oh, wow, we can have a real estate development, subdivide this. Ooh, we can make a lot of money on this land. No, the way that land was bought and sold was you were paying for the right to harvest until the year of Jubilee. Every 50 years was Jubilee. There would be 7 sabbatical years, and the year after that, because 7 times 7 is 49, year after is 50. So the year after the 7th sabbatical year was the year of Jubilee. Land went back to the family, clan, and tribe that had originally owned it. The idea here is since each of the tribes has an allotment of land, there was supposed to be a preservation of the map as it originally stood. Okay, so if I were to sell a piece of property this year and the year of Jubilee is in 2062, the price would be based on 50 years expected harvest. But let's say that I sold it 10 years from now. Well, then I would be selling 40 years. Well, let's say that 10 years after I sell it, I want to buy it back. The price that I pay is equal to the number of years remaining until the year of Jubilee. Notice how important it is if we drop back to Ruth chapter 1, that we notice that it says there that the length of time that the family had stayed in Moab was 10 years. What we have going on here is that the land has been in Poloni Elmoni's possession for 10 years, and Naomi is wanting to have the land redeemed. Let's now go to a passage that's going to help us understand why was redemption needed. Elimelech sold the harvest to Poloni Elmoni 10 years earlier. And so then Naomi comes back and she wants to redeem the land. She has no money. She's not able to do this. Likely, that money was all gone during the 10 years. Can you imagine the medical bills? Yeah. Okay, it was all gone. She's come back destitute and she's wanting to have the land redeemed. Someone will need to do it for her. In Leviticus, it said that if she had the financial ability to redeem it, she could have redeemed it, but she didn't have that. So Elimelech's brothers, either Poloni Elmoni or Boaz, could redeem it for Naomi. Now you notice in the slide here, I've shown the Brooklyn Bridge. And the reason that I've done that is some people look at this and they say, this is an interesting transaction. She sold it once, now she wants to sell it again. No, that's not exactly how it works. People often say, I've got a bridge to sell you. and they'll give the wrong name to it. Brooklyn Bridge isn't really its name. It's the East River Bridge. It's just a nickname that's been given to it of the Brooklyn Bridge, so it's a standing joke. Is that what's happening here? No. Elimelech sold the land. He was paid for however many years of harvest remained until the year of Jubilee. Naomi wants to have the land back in her possession. She doesn't have money. But the law requires that someone, a brother, the next in line, step forward to buy the land. That will put money into Naomi's hands. And we're going to find out that Poloni Elmoni has no problem giving her money. He is not interested in having a child who becomes the inheritor. He wants no part of that. So, the law required someone to step forward, and Boaz made it very clear to Poloni Elmoni that it's either going to happen through him or it's going to happen through Boaz. Now in verse 4, Boaz continues, "And I thought to inform you, saying, buy back in the presence of the inhabitants and the elders of my people. If you will redeem it, redeem it. But if you will not redeem it, then tell me that I may know, for there is no one but you to redeem it, and I am next after you." And he said, "I will redeem it." Poloni Elmoni figures, okay, it's going to put me in a little bit of a cash flow crunch, but you know, Naomi is a little old. Naomi is not going to have any children. So when Naomi dies, then my cash flow problems are all over and I've got all this land. Poloni Elmoni doesn't want the field to go into someone else's hands. He doesn't want it to go to Boaz, so he says, I'm willing to have a little bit of a cash flow problem in order to ultimately end up owning this. So he's comfortable with this. He says, okay, this is fine. But you notice Boaz was very shrewd. He only mentioned Naomi's name in this verse. But now here comes the kicker, verses 5 and 6, where he says that, well, actually, you don't buy it from Naomi. The one who actually holds the title deed, so to speak, is Ruth. Poloni Elmoni is taken back. Whoops, that's not what I was figuring on. Verses 5 and 6. Then Boaz said, on the day that you buy the field from the hand of Naomi, you must also buy it from Ruth the Moabitess, the wife of the dead, to perpetuate the name of the dead through his inheritance. And the close relative said, I cannot redeem it for myself, lest I ruin my own inheritance. You redeem the right of my right of redemption for yourself, for I cannot redeem it. As we noticed last week, de facto, because Elimelech is out of the land and the second brother is the one who owns this, he has 2/3 of the land that would have belonged to his father. And Boaz has 1/4. If the redemption takes place in the way that Boaz is saying, what's going to happen is the right of redemption that Poloni Elmoni is going to end up with is only going to be 1/4 of the land. He goes from 2/3 down to 1/4 because half goes to the offspring of Ruth. That's out of his jurisdiction. So he's saying, to redeem Ruth makes this an unattractive deal. I go from owning all this land to only owning this much. And the son that would be born through Ruth becomes wealthier than me, and I become essentially a pauper. And he says, I don't want anything to do with this. He says, no way. If it were strictly a real estate transaction, he was happy to do so and just wait for Naomi to die, and then he takes over all. But as it stands, he says, this is not attractive. I go from being the big shot to being a relatively little guy, and he didn't want any part of it. He was not concerned about doing what the Lord had to say because he did what was right in his own eyes. Well, verses 7 and 8, this gives a green light to Boaz. How do you like that traffic light? In verses 7 and 8, now this was the custom in former times in Israel concerning redeeming and exchanging. To confirm anything, one man took off his sandal and gave it to the other, and this was confirmation in Israel. Therefore the close relative said to Boaz, buy it for yourself, and he took off his sandal. Here's what the concept is. If you give your boot to someone else, that person now puts his footprints on his land, whereas you used to own the shoe, and you used to put your footprints on your land. So this was a way of symbolically saying, it's no longer mine, it's yours to walk on. It's yours to harvest. And you notice I have a famous footprint on the moon, and it's only Americans that ever put footprints on the moon. I wonder who owns the moon. Who? I think God has the final title deed, though. So, now we have to make this a legal transaction. So in verses 9 and 10, it will be witnessed by the elders of the city. Verses 9 and 10. And Boaz said to the elders and all the people, you are witnesses this day that I have bought all that was Elimelech's, and all that was Kilion's and Mahlon's from the hand of Naomi. Moreover, Ruth the Moabitess, the widow of Mahlon, I have acquired as my wife to perpetuate the name of the dead through his inheritance, that the name of the dead may not be cut off from among his brethren and from his position at the gate. You are witnesses this day. We note that this is a formal meeting that has taken place before the elders, and what Boaz is doing is he's saying, I am following through on all the things that the law expects for me to do. The elders know that Poloni Almoni has stepped aside and said, I'm not interested. Boaz stepped forward. A legal transaction has occurred. Now we do need to explain a couple of things. First, you notice he says that he acquired a wife. And that word is often used for financial transactions. And people have looked at this and have thought, were wives property in Israel? No, they were not. But the fact that a real estate transaction is the overall issue, what Boaz has done is to continue with the terminology that was used. He's acquired the fields, and he now has a wife. This week I came to the conclusion, something that I had not reached before. I think that Ruth actually became his wife. I used to leave open the possibility that it was strictly a levirate marriage and that his wife was still living. At this point, I would say that when it says that he calls her wife, I believe that she has become his wife and that he was a widower. So I had not been able to resolve that, but the use of this term has caused me to say, okay, it looks like a happier ending than I used to think it was. Obviously, Boaz is considerably older than Ruth, so I'm sure that she became a widow probably not that many years after this. But we have a legal transaction that has occurred. Boaz has pledged to do all that the Lord has expected of him. And notice in verse 11a, the elders confirm it. So it's as good as having a sealed deed. And all the people who were at the gate and the elders said, "We are witnesses." So right there at that point, they've seen the exchange of the shoe. They know that the transaction has occurred. Everything is going forward. And I find it very interesting in 11b through 12 what is wished upon Boaz and Ruth. In verses 11b through 12, the wish is that they would be like the house of Perez. There are actually three reasons that Perez would be mentioned in this passage. All three are pertinent. First, Perez was the offspring of a levirate marriage, the first one that's recorded in the Bible, Genesis chapter 38. And you notice my picture here. I have a stump, but the stump is still growing. It looks like that tree was cut off and gone, but it continues. And so Perez was the offspring of a levirate marriage. If that levirate marriage had not taken place, the line of Judah would have come to an end. And Jesus Christ comes out of the line of Judah. Furthermore, Perez was an ancestor of Boaz, as we find in Ruth chapter 4, verses 18 through 21. Finally, evidence from Chronicles and from Kings show that the family of Perez settled in the area of Bethlehem, which makes sense since Boaz is of that lineage. Let's look at that line of Perez. Next slide. The lineage that's given to us at the end of Ruth is of Perez on down through Boaz and to David. The book was written after David had become king or after he had been anointed as king. We don't know the exact date of writing. But both Perez and Obed, which Obed is a very interesting name. It means to be a servant. Both of them are products of a levirate marriage. God's provision becomes very important for the lineage of Jesus Christ and for him to be able to be born on earth and for him to then be able to die in our place, pay our death penalty, and give us everlasting life. It becomes a very important feature. Let's look now at verse 13. So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife, and he went in to her. The Lord gave her conception, and she bore a son. Within this book, it's extremely important that there is a son born who is able to take the inheritance that came down through Elimelech and to preserve the inheritance of land, as well as there to be a lineage. Now, do notice as we read this, verse 13 once again, so Boaz took Ruth and she became his wife, and when he went in to, that's two separate words. You notice that? It's not one word, it's two words in your text. That's an extremely important concept here. People often think that the Hebrew text sometimes gets a little graphic. It is not graphic at all. Notice here I have Boaz's quarters and Ruth's quarters. and it means he went to her quarters. And it's very much like the language that's used in Revelation chapter 3:20. In to, as two separate words, has a different connotation. He went to visit her. That's essentially what it's saying. Now, let's consider verse 14 and the wish that is given. So Boaz took, and then the women said to Naomi, "Blessed be the Lord, who has not left you this day without a close relative, and may his name be famous in Israel." There is thanksgiving to the Lord here. Isn't this different than what had happened only a matter of days before when Naomi came into town? And people said, "Wow, Naomi's here." And she said, "Don't call me pleasant. Don't call me Naomi. Call me Mara. Call me bitter, because the Lord has been very bitter. I went out full and I came back empty." Whoa. Haven't things changed in a few days? She has gone from seeing the Lord as being against her to seeing that the Lord is good and the Lord is behind her. How easy it is as we look at our circumstances in life for us to say, everything is stacked against me. And when we do that, how much ministry do we have with anybody? Zero. In fact, we become a negative. We subtract from the cause of Christ. But notice how the women are able to look and say, "Isn't the Lord good?" The Lord has not left you, Naomi, without a close relative to redeem you. And may he be famous. May the Lord heap blessing upon him, because he has followed the word of the Lord. And look at the blessing that happens when people do what the Lord says. So then, in verses 15 through 17, Naomi's nest is no longer empty. It never was quite empty, because even after she lost her husband and her sons, she still had her daughters-in-law that were real treasures. But now she's going to be a grandma. And so in verses 15 through 17, "And may he be to you a restorer of life and a nourisher of your old age, for your daughter-in-law who loves you is better to you than 7 sons has borne him." This is looking at Obed, the child who is born. Then Naomi took the child and laid him on her bosom and became a nurse to him. Also the neighbor women gave him a name, saying, "There is a son born to Naomi," and they called his name Obed, servant. He is the father of Jesse, the father of David. From there, then we find out why this book is written. This book is written in order to show God's provision being of protecting the line that culminated in David able to become king. We noticed earlier in the book, if you look up again at chapter 4, verse 7, where it said, "Now this was the custom in former times in Israel concerning redeeming and exchanging." The idea of the sandal exchange was not the custom in David's day, but it was the custom in Boaz's day. This book is clearly being written later. It is written during the time that either David is king or after David had been anointed to be king. So it's known that David is going to become king, and as we look at this lineage, we see how God has preserved the line so that Israel can have David as king. Perez, Hezron, Ram, Aminadab, Nahshon, Salmon, Boaz, Obed, Jesse, David. Verse 18. Now this is the genealogy of Perez. Perez begot Hezron. Hezron begot Ram, and Ram begot Aminadab. Aminadab begot Nahshon, and Nahshon begot Salmon. Salmon begot Boaz, and Boaz begot Obed. Obed begot Jesse, and Jesse begot David. We see God's provision. Elimelech ran away from the land because he didn't think God was providing. Naomi came back to the land thinking that God was against her. But not only has God worked in the lives of these individuals, but he has worked in the life of the nation Israel that they can have their second king, David. And in an even bigger way, we can have Jesus Christ. God works his plan. And we at the horizontal plane, we often miss it. We look and we say, life is awful, life is terrible, and everything's going against me, and we don't see God's provision. This book is a reminder that God is able to work not only at the individual level, but at the national level, and he is able to accomplish his small purposes and his big purposes. Let's look once again at the picture of the four doctors. If it hadn't been for the miracle of art restoration, our friend Dr. Halstead would be faceless. Well, Poloni Almoni is nameless as far as we're concerned. But someone who up until this point in life looked like and also ran, I mean, can you imagine? People would look and they'd say, wow, look at Poloni Almoni, and then, oh, look at Boaz. But what happened? God elevated Boaz, and he's in the lineage not only of David, but in the lineage of Jesus Christ. And how do you think people looked at Ruth when she came over from Moab? Oh, she's a Moabitess. How do people look at Ruth when they realize how God worked through that believing woman? I find lots of encouragement here. We have reason to do things the Lord's way because God is faithful. I love the book of Ruth. Let's pray.